everybody, and welcome to the Tech Trailblazers podcast. We're here with GigaOm, and we're doing the Tech on Fire series, which is very exciting, where we look forward into the future and look a little bit into the past as well. I'm delighted to be joined here from West Texas by Chris Grundemann. Hi, Chris. Hello.
Hi. Very well. Good to talk to you today, Rose.
Yeah, likewise. So you focus on networking. Do you want to give us a bit of your background? Because you've got an awful lot of experience. You know, we're delighted to be speaking to you about the whole networking side of innovation and how we're seeing startups coming up in that space and what we have been seeing and what we're likely to see. But for anybody who perhaps has not had the pleasure of hearing you do one of your podcasts or spoken to you in the past, it'd be great to find out a little bit more about Chris.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So my background, I guess, is a network engineer by trade. I worked on some small ISPs in Colorado. Wireless internet service provider was kind of where I cut my teeth, and then worked on a network that's now part of NTT, and worked on another big network that's now part of Lumen. I also then did some work in the cable industry. So at a nonprofit called Cable Labs, which holds the DOCSIS standards, and they kind of do all the development work on behalf of the cable industry, and did that for a little while, and was lucky enough to get my name on some patents while I was doing that, and wrote a couple books along the way. And then I spent a couple of years working with the Internet Society, and their goal is that the internet is for everyone. And so I did a lot of traveling. I gave talks at network operator group meetings and other types of events around the world in like 35 different countries. And then the last 5 or 6 years, almost 7 years, I guess now, has been more focused on enterprise IT. So bringing that networking background as well into the data centers and into the campus networks, but then also looking at security and now more and more AI as well, and how that is going to play out in the IT world.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us, Chris. So we're looking, just to dwell a little bit more on what you've done. So you've been a network engineer and you've got 8 patents, or you're
Yeah, that's right.
Co-named on a number of patents.
Yeah.
And also you're an author, and you've also been involved with an IETF RFC, I believe, as well.
That's correct. Yes, I've done some work in the IETF, both from the angle of Cable Labs and then later on through the Internet Society. And so, yeah, I do have one RFC out there with my name on it, which is cool.
Yeah, got quite a badge of honor there. And you also podcast as well with a co-judge of ours, Stephen Foskett, around enterprise AI. So tell us, networking's come a long way in the last 10 years. What do you think have been some of the most significant innovations sort of that you've seen in that? And obviously IP's become prolific over the last sort of 15, 20 years. But what are you seeing as having been sort of some of the milestones, I guess, in networking over the last decade? Yeah,
so I think you're right. I think that, the just a proliferation of the internet and the internet protocol suite, right, TCP/IP, and how networking has gotten into kind of every facet of life is definitely a big part of that. And we've seen, in large part that's happened in the last 10 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. I like to say that, kind of the first 30 years of networking was figuring out if it would work. And then we spent 30 years kind of making it work. And now we're in a phase, it seems, that we're really working on how it works. And what I mean is it's all about quality of experience and ensuring that not just you have connectivity, but you have quality connectivity, right? Does this video show up clearly? Can I hear you? Can the applications I'm using work? And can they work from wherever I want to work? And all of that's obviously based on the network and the infrastructure underlying all of this IT. And again, going into facets of all kinds of modern life now.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly become a lot more important over the last 18 months or so, as a lot of us have been relying on the internet to just go about our daily jobs. So what have you seen that's been particularly insightful? I mean, you've talked about how ubiquitous it's become throughout all aspects of our lives, but what's really allowed that to happen?
Yeah. It's definitely not. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, what have been the big steps, the big leaps forward that we've seen in networking?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think that, one of the things is the basis is still a lot of hardware out there, right? And these switches and routers, which have grown up over time and obviously, higher and higher bandwidth and larger chips and ASICs on those switches in order to allow higher bandwidths and lower latency and all of those things. But I think a lot of what's happened in the recent, last 10 years and especially now going forward is the aspect of software in networking. And so not just the operating systems that are running on those routers and switches, but more and more there's software and programs up around it, right? So one example is SD-WAN, which I think has been a big kind of game changer, I guess, over the last 2 or 3, 4 years. Some folks started dabbling in it earlier than that. Now it's becoming fairly widespread. A lot of enterprises are looking into an SD-WAN type solution. And what that basically does is, is decoupling the control plane from that hardware plane so that I can have a cloud-based, network operations software that runs this network. And one of the interesting things there, I think, is that a big part of what it's doing is, making the internet part of folks' wide area network, right? And what I mean by that is in enterprise networking for a long time, if you rewind, it's probably even further than 10 years ago, but back far enough, you really had servers in a closet, maybe, at your office. You had people working at desks in their office. Everything was connected together with Ethernet cables in that office. And you put a firewall on the internet connection and you built, a private network to your data center. And then eventually you moved those servers from that closet to the data center. But there was still this area where it was your infrastructure, right? It was a network that you had gone out and bought these pieces of hardware and these circuits and put it all together. And you really kind of had that ownership of this infrastructure. And now with the advent of cloud computing and virtualization kind of taking over, where we've moved a lot of applications, again, off those servers, we're no longer necessarily putting them in a co-location facility and then definitely not on premises at our own office, but we're connecting to the cloud, which is, of course, infrastructure we don't own. And we're connecting it to it over the internet, which is infrastructure we don't own. And so understanding how to, provide quality of experience over this infrastructure that you don't actually have total control over is a big part of, I think, what's going on right now. And that's happening in the networking world, but also in the security world as well, where, I just don't have that perimeter where I can lock the doors and everything's safe inside of that anymore, because there really aren't any doors, right? People are working from wherever they might be, at home, obviously lately, a lot more than they had in the past. And the applications they're connecting to are again, out there on the cloud somewhere. They're either SaaS applications or applications running on infrastructure as a service on one of these big public cloud providers.
So, you touched upon security there as being one of those elements. And certainly and I think previous discussions that I've had with some of your colleagues at GigaOm is around the fact that, security perhaps was one of the issues that held enterprises back from the whole cloud engagement, really. So, you'd put something that wasn't particularly important, you'd pop it out on the cloud and everybody'd be happy about that. Then people start to say, oh, well, are we opening ourselves up to stuff? Can we put, there's performance, there's security, there's all of those elements. And so what you're saying is this whole software defined aspect has helped people to be able to not just deal with the performance, but also to help allay some of the fears that there may have been around the security about using the cloud. Or do you think it's more than that?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I think for sure the security was a big piece of this in moving things to the cloud. And there's still, places and areas where you don't want to move things to the cloud for whatever reason. There are, companies that are doing, extremely proprietary things that they want to keep on premises, or they have some very specific requirements and they need to do that. But in general, we have kind of built the tools to allow most companies to be able to use the cloud in many cases. And definitely then that is, I think, leading to what, if you look at like the trend of the SASE, which a lot of people are talking about these days, where we basically added all these security features onto an SD-WAN platform and now have this converged security and networking, which again, that leads to cultural shifts as well as technological ones, because, used to be the security team and the network team where we're different folks with different skill sets and different budgets within a company a lot of times. And now that's all kind of being squished together. And again, yeah, so it's interesting that I think the cloud is kind of the reason that this is all happening, and also an enabling function of it, right? Because the reason that the model of SASE works is because I can put these security appliances in the cloud. And then, of course, they're accessible from anywhere. So people can be working from home or from a coffee shop or from wherever they need to be and still have all that full security. So we're really kind of allowing this secure and mobile workforce to take shape. And I think that, we were lucky enough that a lot of that technology was in place and at least available, if not being totally used, 18 months ago when the COVID pandemic started, and has definitely taken off from there because it's, such an enabling technology for this kind of, again, secure and mobile workforce, I would call it.
Yeah. Interesting. You talk about the different teams and it being a cultural shift. Which do you think has been the bigger challenge for companies? Has it been the cultural shift or the technology shift?
Well, I think they're really related. I think that the technology is definitely, I think, causing these cultural shifts that are required. And always, yeah, I think people tend to be the harder part of any change. There's a lot of folks who learn to do something a certain way and then want to continue doing it. There's, those different lines of silos or whatever, teams, and those boundary lines have been drawn. And so figuring out how to work across those teams is super important, right? I mean, one example is like the virtualization that we did inside data centers with things like VMware or other technologies that then added network virtualization in there. And now you have this, portal that used to be just where folks who were running the servers and storage would go to do things with their, storage and compute virtualization. And now you add networking into that, and now you add security into that. And there becomes this question of, okay, well, who does what job now? Because the tools I used to use as a network engineer were just, maybe logging directly into the CLI of these switches. And now I've got a virtualized network layer, whether it's SD-WAN or something else inside of, the compute layer, where it's a different tool set and it's a different mentality of how things work. And so I think that's, a struggle and a challenge for a lot of folks. And not just within networking and not even just in security, but broader, right? This whole shift to the cloud has definitely, I think, changed the way that a lot of IT operates. And we're still dealing with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously a lot of people had to accelerate their digital transformation. They had to get cloud quick, right? Not about get cloud first, it's cloud quick. Do you think that's had an impact on some of the other aspects? Because moving speed doesn't always give people the time to really ensure that things kind of have everything in place. It's a little, I wouldn't say belt and braces. That's probably a little bit extreme, because I'm sure it isn't that case, I hope. But do you think that now is going to be a period of, now that it's been done, a lot of this has been done, are we going to have to look at retrofitting some of the other aspects that maybe we're like, oh, maybe we should have done that?
Sure, I think so. I think there's a constant evolution for sure. And I think that, there's still a lot of work to be done, just even in just the general kind of, everything that's folded under this idea of digital transformation and understanding that, today, almost every business it's in some way a technology business. And they may not directly be selling software or have an app necessarily, but a lot do. And a lot, even if that's not how you interact with customers directly, there's still all this stuff on the back end that is how you operate internally, right? Whether you're using, some kind of CRM or some kind of messaging app, or, almost all of the email and calendaring and those kind of things have all kind of gone online into cloud services. But there's still a lot of work happening in refactoring of applications and moving them there. And then, again, kind of connecting these kind of traditional traditional campus and data center networks up to the cloud networks. And I think, there's a big industry involved in doing that right now, right? So folks are building a lot more data centers with a lot more interconnectivity to be able to connect, between data centers to campuses to cloud applications and have that all kind of work seamlessly. And so you've got, new players in the space that are building networks that weren't, ever something that was even imagined before, in order to kind of enable some of this massive interconnection between companies and between vendors and partners and all those things.
Cool. Well, you're giving me a great segue there, Chris.
Yeah.
You talk about new players, and clearly the Tech Trailblazers is all about the startup community, the innovation that you see in that environment. So do you think this is a good time for the networking and perhaps other startups who are maybe still quite fledgling or have an idea now that maybe is more pertinent because of the fact that we've got this much bigger, what's the best way to say it? I want to say bigger embracing of the cloud. And yeah, that's probably the right word, is people have kind of had to give it a really big hug and go, right, we're in on this one now. Is this a good time to be a networking startup?
I think so. Yeah. I think, again, going back to that, idea of software kind of eating the world, and it's definitely happening within networking as well. And because of that, right, you don't necessarily have to be manufacturing hardware in order to sell networking applications. That wasn't always true, right? It used to be really, you went and got an appliance when you needed whatever it was, whether it was a router, a switch, or a firewall, or a load balancer, or something else. You went and bought, some pieces of metal that were manufactured somewhere. And now a lot of that can be done with just software. And so that obviously opens the door for a lot more players to be able to come in and not have to, spin up giant manufacturing processes. I also think that, to our points we've been talking about through this conversation already, is so many things have changed, and it is a very dynamic space, which I guess, obviously, everyone's always talked about IT being something that changes often. But I think we're definitely seeing on an unprecedented scale, right? And just the base architecture of how people connect things together is shifting. And that's all the way from, like we talked about already, one area, SD-WAN, I think is an area where we saw some startups come in, and some of that's already consolidated a little bit. But now there's, again, networking folks working with security folks, and security is becoming more important in all these things. And so there's all the pieces and parts that go into that SASE model we've talked about, and whether that's a CASB or a secure web gateway or all these things. And then, in the security space, it blows up even more, right? And there's, I think, a ton of players coming into cybersecurity right now in all kinds of different avenues to try and protect all these different ways of connecting and different places we have applications. And so, web application firewalls and load balancers and that kind of stuff is definitely seeing a bit of a renaissance, I think. And then you move into, where we get into the nuts and bolts of like container networking and microservices. And we've seen service mesh come out. And I think obviously almost everybody in the service mesh space is a brand new player to networking. And they're riding an interesting line between the software applications, the DevOps type folks, and the traditional IT folks, and how to create this, secure network inside of these container environments that are moving and changing all the time. And so there's definitely a lot of different areas, I think, where there's great chance for startups who are being successful and who will be in the near future.
Yeah, and I know certainly, I think most of it, because we've only had containers as a category for a number of years, because obviously it didn't exist right at the beginning of when we started. But I think most of those have either gone on to, I think that most of them have been acquired or are huge fundraisers. So, I mean, we've seen a lot of success from our winners over the years, but they've been unusually, like, consistently, big raise, acquisition, dum. So, I mean, you've talked about that, and we've talked about where we've kind of got to, I suppose, right now. So what are you seeing? Where are we going to see the next steps? Are we obviously going to continue to see a lot of innovation in the areas you've discussed? Which are the really hot ones? Which are the ones that you would be very interested to be seeing how they play out over the next sort of few years? Yeah.
So one thing we haven't talked much about is the infusion of artificial intelligence into these other systems. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And so I think that's where a lot of innovation is going to happen in both networking and the security space, is using, the term AI ops is now becoming fairly common, although it's, the actual systems that are doing it aren't quite all the way there yet, which I think is why there's a lot of room for innovation still. It's finding new ways to use these algorithms to, assist us, right? And really it's a co-pilot thing. I don't think that we're going to see, completely self-driving networks where you don't need an operator at all, at least not for a very, very long time. But I think we will see more and more areas where the systems we're using are giving us helpful hints into what's going on. If there's a performance problem that's lurking, behind some fuzzy data, or there's some trend line that's looks like it might do something bad in the next few days or few weeks, you're going to get these kind of more proactive alerts about what's going on in the network, whether it's just, quality of experience or connectivity issues, or again, the security piece. I think that is another piece that's going to be really big, is that continuing convergence of networking and security. And I think it'll play out in different ways in different environments and different industries, but I think we will definitely see and have seen security becoming more and more important in so many places, right? And that's true of application developers. We're talking about shifting security left, but it's also true in the network, where just connecting the two wires together isn't enough anymore, right? It's really, we're looking at things like network segmentation and encryption everywhere. And then how do we make sure that all works out? So I think those are two big areas, right? That AI coming in and helping us, and security be coming in and becoming more pervasive inside the network are two of the biggest areas amongst some of the other ones we've already talked about. I couldn't agree more. I'm very excited to see what we're going to be having as entrants this year. So we talked about those elements, and I think, the automation, the AI piece of pretty much all of what we're seeing. We've seen a huge surge in the number of AI startups who are coming and knocking on the door. And certainly they do tend to sort of fit with something else. So they may well have a security element to them. They may have a networking element to them. So aside from those, I mean, one of the things that obviously I have talked about previously with some of your colleagues, but IoT as well, obviously not necessarily your focus, but obviously that's stuff that's network people responsible for networks have to think about. So what are the challenges from a networking perspective on that side of things? Yeah, that is another big area. And I think, obviously the first thing is just the sheer number of devices being connected to the network is growing astronomically, right? And so when you're talking about, devices that are meant for a human to interact with the system, there's a limitation there by just the population. There's only so many devices you can carry around, right? There's only so many, you might need a tablet and a phone and a laptop, but that's about the limit for most folks. But when you start talking about putting sensors onto everything, obviously the numbers are just staggering. And so just the general being able to connect things is a big challenge there. And then obviously we've seen these new low power WAN protocols come out. So LoRa is one, there's some others, there's some more proprietary ones and some other open ones, but enabling these sensors to be able to send small amounts of data at really low bandwidths to keep the power envelope really, really small so that these sensors can live. The goal, right, is to have these watch battery type devices out there in the field for up to 10 years. Because you don't want to have to be going out and replacing these things all the time. And you can't have them, plugged into real power all the time. If they're monitoring the temperature of a package in a frozen truck, it needs to be able to move around and move from truck to truck. And so it's got to be running on battery power. And so being able to do that is super important as well. So between just the number of devices and the types of environments they're in, I think those are definite networking challenges that are being addressed right now. And that's a really interesting new space. We're digging into it actually pretty deeply at GigaOm. And it's emerging, right? I mean, it's happening right now. And it's one of the most fun things I get to do is try to tease out what that's actually going to look like, because I think it's not quite clear yet. There's a lot of players with overlap and people figuring out where their niche is.
Yeah. I mean, that's the challenge, isn't it? And also for the people who are going to buy it, because I mean, obviously, the people who tend to buy the research that you're involved with and you write are the people who are trying to make those purchasing decisions, right?
Yeah, right.
So I bet neither of us going, I'm glad I don't have to do that job, because that sounds like a bit of a nightmare over the next decade. What do you think they're looking for? What's going to be key for them? Particularly, let's say, from a startup's perspective, what's going to help shift the needle for them? Because it's always a big step, isn't it? I mean, enterprise technology, when you're responsible for that, there's an awful lot of things with price tags that you already have to pay for, right? The basics, right? So despite the fact we're talking about how great it is to have innovation and it's all wonderful and it's a great opportunity for startups, but at the end of the day, someone's got to buy this stuff, right? Because you can get as much VC funding as you like, but at the end of the day, somebody has to have a need for it. Somebody has to have a problem that they're willing to part with their hard-earned budget or the company's hard-earned budget. And there will be a lot of pressure in those purses right now because people are trying to save money. So how do you stop being seen as a cost? How do you take what your new, shiny networking innovation is and turn that into something that somebody at an enterprise level is going to be wanting to buy or feeling that they have to buy? What's going to be, the silver bullet for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, my most basic advice there is a lot like the stock tip, which is to buy low and sell high. And what I mean is, the key really, I think, is it needs to not be a cost center, right? So you need to be finding a way to save that person money, make them money, or lower their risk. And really, I think you've got to do one of those three things for a business to be able to, gain customers. Obviously, that's very reductionist and pretty simple and probably straightforward. But I do think that that's going to be the key, is looking at ways where, what is the actual bottom line business change that I can enable with this technology? Because to your point, right now is not an environment, and it rarely is an environment where I can just throw money at toys, right? And so I really need to talk to folks about that business change, right? And so I think security is definitely something that's changed. The dialogue around security has changed drastically in the last 10 years. And I think it will continue to over the next 10 years. And so that's an area where, by mitigating that risk, you're actually saving a company potentially a lot of money. And so those are ways to get in there. On the networking side, again, it's, what is this transformation that this business is going through, and how can I support that? And again, either help them make money or help them save money. And whether that's, higher efficiency because I'm putting sensors on all the devices in a factory. And so now I can tell when they're about to break down. That's a really good reason to spend some money in that factory, right? And get higher efficiency levels and get mean time to repair down lower and things like that. So I think it's really about tying it to the business.
I mean, when people pitch their technology to you, because obviously people want you to know what's happening, how do you think we're faring with this in the startup world when you speak to technologists who have a new innovation, or perhaps an innovation which isn't 100% new, but it's a different take on something that's already out there? Are they getting it right? Are they able to express themselves in that sort of way that can resonate to the enterprise IT buyer?
Definitely some do. I don't think it's true across the board. I think that there is some innovation that's happening today that's almost innovation for innovation's sake and is looking, is our solutions looking for problems. But I do think that for the most part, most folks are coming at this from an area of, they see an actual need and are trying to fill it. So I think in general, I think most people are getting it right. Of course, it needs to be fine-tuned over time because those stories are going to change, right, as the environment around it changes. So I think generally, though, most folks are tapping into these, key trends and doing a fairly good job of then connecting that back to the actual business need.
Yeah, I think that's also helps that a lot of them have to pitch to the VC community. So they have to keep things fairly sort of high level on some and focus on those business needs, because you can't guarantee that somebody's going to give you money is going to fully understand the pain points. So you need to be able to express those. What is the pain of your customer and how do you alleviate that pain?
Yeah, that's very true.
So, we talked a little bit about AI. I mean, is that a bit of a silver bullet for this type of thing? Because AI feels like it helps save money. Now, everybody's obviously gets a little bit nervous about that because it sounds like, we're going to lose headcount. We're going to, is that really true? Because a lot of people I speak to in that enterprise IT environment are saying, well, it's not really the case. It's more about doing the more mundane stuff that, somebody would just be beating their head against the wall if they had to do it day in, day out, or being able to do more stuff that just isn't humanly possible because you're dealing with, an attack surface, a threat landscape, for example, in security, that's just so vast that you couldn't possibly, they just pick up the anomalies and then somebody kind of like sifts through that, can give the human eye and the experience to that. Oh, that doesn't look quite right. That's been popped up. Would you say that's correct?
I do. I do think that's right. I think that, automation in general and an artificial intelligence and down into the machine learning and neural networks is kind of the deepest areas of automation. It is a big thing. And I don't think we're talking about anybody really losing their jobs over it. And what I mean is there's so much work out there to be done now, as we've been talking about, right? All these trends we've been talking about, the internet and networking becoming more and more of every business and digital transformation and security becoming more important. The number of connected devices is growing. The number of people using these things is growing. The importance of it to the business is growing. And so, at this point, really, really good automation working everywhere is just helping us stay afloat. Right. So I think it does potentially save costs in that you maybe don't have to hire a ton more people. But there's already more work than we have skilled people for. And so giving them the best tools possible, to your point, to kind of take some of that day-to-day mundane tasks off their plate and let them do the more big picture thinking is absolutely helpful and is needed. And I don't think we should be too worried about it as far as job security and IT.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be. There's always been discussion about the skills gap, and we don't seem to ever quite be able to kind of make it any smaller. In fact, I think we're possibly making it larger because obviously the diversity of what we can do now from a tech perspective is just keeps growing and keeps growing. I mean, do you think that actually automation will buy us the time to get that skills gap addressed? Because it will allow us to perhaps encourage people to take on some of these more exciting roles and more creative roles and more where you perhaps move more rewarding roles.
Yeah, I think it will. I think it has to. I think that we need this level of automation to stay as caught up as we are now and not fall further behind, to your point. I think that we'll do the best we can with it as an industry. And I think there's still, I don't know that we're going to see like the skills gap go away, right? I think that for a long time, definitely if we're talking about the last 10 years versus the next 10 years, I think for the next 10 years, we will still see network and security job postings go unfilled for long periods of time because there's just not enough people to do the amount of work that's needed right now. So these tools are going to be the thing that helps us get through that.
And I always think the problem is that the skills keep moving forward and we can never quite keep up.
Yeah.
We're like chasing behind the curve of what's needed versus what is actually humanly possible to keep getting people to learn.
Exactly.
So, we've talked about the networking side of things, a lot of the good stuff that we're seeing. Where do you think we're not seeing innovation that we should be seeing? Are there any gaps? We talked about the skills gap. Have we got a technology gap as well?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I can think of an area where, I see a real big need that's not being filled at the moment. I think that one area that doesn't get maybe enough attention, not necessarily from a startup kind of producing a product point of view, but just from a mind share of the industry point of view, is the dirty little secret about software is that it all runs on hardware, and I think that we've definitely kind of seen a shift in what most people understand as what IT infrastructure is. And so, there's a lot of folks who are maybe coming into IT jobs now. They're maybe in their 20s and just got out of college, and their job as an IT infrastructure engineer is to work on AWS, which is great and is needed, or Azure or GCP or Oracle or whatever, right? Where they're working on some public cloud where they're basically just interfacing with a software interface that can, use all this virtualization to give them the infrastructure they need. But they have no exposure to the servers or storage arrays or routers or switches or firewalls or the actual hardware that lives underneath that. And so we may actually be making this a new and worse skills gap where that kind of base level infrastructure, the actual connecting the switches together, connecting the routers together, and knowing how that stuff works is something that, I am concerned that we could fade away from that too much, and that there's going to be less people available to do that kind of work than there has been in the past, because we're looking at infrastructure from a different layer now.
Yeah. Well, I think parents will understand that is when you try to explain what a landline is. Right. Yeah. What is that? You don't need that. You've got a mobile. Why would you need something that's plugged into the wall, right?
Right.
I think that's an interesting aspect. It's certainly something that I think we need to bear in mind. There's something about actually knowing that there are flashing lights, there are cables coming out the back of the box, and there's stuff happening sort of physically somewhere that, is powering what you're interfacing into. Cool. And anything else? So there was one thing that we haven't talked about, which I was a bit surprised we hadn't. So I'm just going to put that out there. We've already put out IoT stuff, and it kind of relates, I think, to a degree, but the edge. Talking about edge networks, sort of, core versus edge, and how we've kind of developed these sort of subsections within the networking world. Do you think the edge is going to be where it's at? Not in a U2 sort of way, but just generally speaking.
Yeah. Well, so I think it depends on what you mean by I think generally yes-ish. But that's because, the edge is wherever it is. And I mean, maybe that's silly, but, there are lots of different edges, I think. And so, there's one way to look at kind of the edge, which is pushing applications as close to users as possible to reduce latency. And that's been kind of the job of what a lot of content distribution networks did in the past, just for content, right? So if you're streaming a movie or something, it's being streamed as close to you as possible. And now I've seen those companies are definitely kind of, adding new features and functionality to actually run more developed applications at the edge and not just streaming content. And so that's one area, right? And then there's another piece where that's definitely happening in the mobile edge, where we're actually pushing this out into the close to the cell sites themselves. And so that, from that perspective, right, that edge is really about lower latency, right? And so better performance for users. And that is actually, again, part of what's, enabling some of these other technologies we've been talking about, right? The cloud security things that are happening, those happen at the data center or POP closest to you. To lower your latency, and they have to happen in a lot of areas so that you can move around and have a distributed company. So yeah, and then it does tie in with the IoT stuff as well, right? So for example, again, if we are talking about the sensors in the factory, I may very well want to run a mini data center in that factory to be able to grab the raw data from all of the sensors and cameras and things right there live, run some artificial intelligence algorithms against it to understand what's going on, and not necessarily transport that up to a public cloud or a big data center somewhere else. And I want to do that locally and then only store the things that I need to store somewhere else, or do processing somewhere else if I have to. So I think we'll see a lot of different development in the edge, whether that's, again, the edge data centers that are kind of where the CDNs are working, or the mobile edge where the mobile operators are doing this, or like I said, I think some companies will actually be going kind of backwards in that history we talked about, where they're actually going to be putting servers kind of back in the closet so that they can do uncompressed research on their data.
But but that's to do with bandwidth and speed and, efficiency again, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Fantastic. So, we've looked back over the networking and touched on, quite extensively on security and AI and looked at that in the future. Is there anything else that you're kind of excited to be seeing what will happen over the next few years, the next decade?
Yeah, I think, the summary there for me from like an operator perspective, from a practitioner perspective, is just the enhanced levels of visibility and control we're getting. And so whether that's just from advanced telemetry or we're actually putting AI into the system or whatever we're doing, there's more and more opportunity to actually understand what's going on at a really granular level and have control over it. And so that I think is kind of across the board a great thing that I'm seeing that will continue to advance and should move the industry forward.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's been really insightful to share, half an hour or so sort of discussing these aspects. I think it's going to be a really interesting time. So really appreciate you sharing some of your insights. I'm sure we'll get to read about more of them over the next sort of 18 months, because I understand you guys are going to be very busy sharing that through reports and whatnot. So thank you. So that's Chris Grundemann. He is with GigaOm and he's an analyst specializing in networking, but very much involved in security and AI as well. My name is Rose Ross and I'm with the Tech Trailblazers, and this has been a Tech on Fire podcast with GigaOm. Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. This was fun.
All right, then. Speak to you soon. Take care now.